September 17, 1943. The dusty rail yard outside Fort McPherson, Georgia shimmered in the late afternoon heat as Private First Class Giovanni Russo stepped off the train onto American soil for the first time. His worn Italian Army uniform hung loose on his frame after months of short rations in North Africa. Around him, 300 other Italian soldiers shuffled forward in a quiet column, their faces revealing a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and profound uncertainty. Giovanni clutched the small photograph in his pocket, the one of his mother and two sisters standing outside their home in Napoli, and wondered if he would ever see them again. What he could not have known in that moment, what none of them could have predicted, was that the next 2 years would fundamentally alter his understanding of the world, of abundance, of human dignity, and of what a nation at war could choose to be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The journey that brought Giovanni Russo to Georgia began 6 months earlier in the scorching desert of Tunisia. He had been a conscript in the Italian Royal Army's 136th Armored Division Centauro, one of the units Mussolini had sent to support German operations in North Africa. Giovanni had never wanted to be a soldier. At 23 years old, he had been studying architecture at the University of Naples when his draft notice arrived in the spring of 1941. His family had wept when he left, his mother pressing rosary beads into his hands and his father, a stonemason who had fought in the Great War, embracing him with the kind of desperate strength that communicates everything words cannot. North Africa had been a nightmare of sand, heat, and futility. The Italian forces were undersupplied, poorly equipped, and increasingly demoralized as the war turned against the Axis powers. Giovanni's division possessed tanks that broke down constantly, ammunition that ran short with alarming frequency, and rations that barely sustained life. The German forces they served alongside treated them with barely concealed contempt, viewing the Italians as inferior allies who could not be trusted with crucial operations. When British and American forces launched Operation Torch in November 1942, establishing beachheads across North Africa, Giovanni had watched the writing appear on the wall with growing clarity. By March 1943, the situation had become desperate. American forces pushed eastward while British forces pressed from multiple directions, steadily compressing Axis holdings into an ever-shrinking pocket. Giovanni's unit found itself cut off from supply lines, surviving on quarter rations, watching their vehicles run dry of fuel one by one. The officers, many of whom had stopped believing in Mussolini's promises of imperial glory long ago, held quiet conversations about the inevitable. When American tanks appeared on the ridge above their position on March 28, 1943, Giovanni's commanding officer, Captain Stefano Benedetti, made the decision that would save their lives. He ordered white flags raised and weapons laid down. The Americans who processed their surrender were efficient and surprisingly courteous. Giovanni had expected brutality. Fascist propaganda had painted Americans as ruthless gangsters, as culturally degenerate criminals who would show no mercy to captured enemies. Instead, he encountered young men not much different from himself. They were given water immediately, the first clean water Giovanni had tasted in weeks. Medical personnel moved through their ranks, identifying the wounded and sick for treatment. They were fed that evening, real food in quantities Giovanni had not seen since leaving Italy. The contrast with how German forces had treated them as subordinate allies was immediate and striking. The captured Italians were transported to temporary holding facilities in Tunisia, where they spent several weeks as the Allied campaign in North Africa concluded. During this period, Giovanni began to understand that something unprecedented was occurring in the broader Italian military structure. News filtered through the camp, carried by newly arriving prisoners, that Italian forces across North Africa were surrendering in massive numbers. The defeat at Tunisia in May 1943 resulted in the capture of over 240,000 Axis soldiers, of which approximately 110,000 were Italian. These men faced a choice that would determine their immediate future. They could be shipped to prisoner of war camps in Britain, where conditions were adequate but austere, or they could volunteer to be sent to camps in the United States, where rumors suggested treatment might be better but which meant traveling across an ocean to a land none of them had ever seen. Giovanni volunteered for America without hesitation. His reasoning was pragmatic rather than ideological. Britain was being bombed regularly by German aircraft. It was close to the war, vulnerable to the fighting that continued to rage across Europe. America was an ocean away, far from the combat, seemingly insulated from the destruction consuming his homeland. If he had to spend the war as a prisoner, better to do so somewhere the bombs would not reach. On July 8, 1943, Giovanni boarded a Liberty ship in the port of Bizerta along with 1,500 other Italian prisoners. The Atlantic crossing took 18 days of close quarters below decks, of seasickness and uncertainty, of wondering what awaited them in this distant country he knew only from films and propaganda. The propaganda had prepared him for a nation of crude materialism, of violence and social decay, of racial hatred and economic exploitation. Fascist newspapers had portrayed America as a mongrel society without culture or refinement, a place where money ruled everything and human dignity counted for nothing. Giovanni, educated enough to recognize propaganda when he heard it, had discounted much of what he'd been told. But he carried no clear picture of what America actually was, no framework for understanding the society he was about to encounter. When the ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia on July 26, 1943, and he caught his first glimpse of the American coastline, he understood only that his war was over and his captivity was beginning. The processing center at Norfolk was his first real contact with American military organization. The efficiency was remarkable. Thousands of prisoners moved through intake procedures with mechanical precision. They were photographed, fingerprinted, issued identification tags, given medical examinations, deloused, provided with clean clothing. American military police maintained order without brutality, their authority expressed through competent organization rather than violence. Giovanni noticed the black soldiers working in some of the processing units, something that would have been unthinkable in the Italian or German militaries where racial theories relegated non-whites to inferior status at best. The Americans seemed to think nothing of it, treating it as ordinary rather than exceptional. From Norfolk, the Italian prisoners were distributed to camps across the American interior. The United States had begun constructing prisoner of war facilities in 1942, anticipating the need to house captured enemy soldiers far from coastal areas where escape might be feasible. By 1943, the system had expanded dramatically. Camps were established in nearly every state, often in rural areas where land was available and security could be maintained without disrupting civilian populations. The camps were designed to comply with Geneva Convention requirements while serving American economic needs. Prisoners would be housed, fed, and treated according to international law, and in return they would provide labor for agriculture and other essential industries facing manpower shortages due to military mobilization. Giovanni's assignment sent him to Camp Como, a facility near Greenville, Mississippi, in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. The train journey from Virginia to Mississippi took 3 days during which Giovanni pressed his face to the windows and watched America unfold before him. The sheer scale of the country was overwhelming. In Italy, you could cross from one end to the other in a day's travel. Here, they passed through states larger than entire Italian regions, each one filled with farms and towns and cities that showed no signs of war damage whatsoever. The abundance was staggering. Every town they passed through looked prosperous, well-fed, untouched by the destruction consuming Europe. Giovanni saw automobiles everywhere, ordinary people driving personal vehicles as though such wealth were commonplace rather than extraordinary. When they reached Mississippi in mid-August, the heat reminded Giovanni of North Africa, but the landscape could not have been more different. Instead of endless sand, he saw endless fields of cotton stretching to the horizon, rich dark soil that spoke of agricultural abundance beyond anything he had known in southern Italy. Camp Como sat on the edge of a massive plantation, 500 acres of flat delta farmland where cotton grew in rows so straight they seemed to have been drawn with a ruler. The camp itself consisted of rows of tar paper barracks surrounded by a single fence topped with barbed wire. 4 guard towers overlooked the perimeter, though Giovanni quickly noticed that the guards seemed almost bored, as though escape attempts were so rare they barely warranted attention. The arrival processing at Camp Como was managed by Captain Harold Morrison, a career Army officer from Iowa who spoke a few words of Italian learned from a phrasebook. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through a combination of broken Italian and hand gestures, Morrison explained the basic rules. Prisoners would work 6 days per week in the cotton fields. They would receive wages for their labor, 80 cents per day paid in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen. They would be housed according to Geneva Convention standards. They would receive the same rations as American soldiers. Any prisoner who attempted escape would be punished, but those who followed regulations would be treated fairly. Morrison's tone was businesslike rather than hostile, as though he were explaining employment terms rather than imprisonment conditions. Giovanni was assigned to Barrack 7, a long wooden structure that housed 40 men on metal frame beds with thin mattresses. His bunkmate was Marco DeLucci, a 30-year-old farmer from Calabria who had served in the same North African campaign. Marco possessed the weathered pragmatism of a man who had spent his life working soil and dealing with circumstances beyond his control. That first night, as they lay in their bunks listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Mississippi night, Marco offered Giovanni the advice that would shape his captivity. "Do the work they ask," he said. "Keep your head down. Watch and learn. This war is over for us. What matters now is surviving until we can go home." The first shock came the next morning at breakfast. The prisoners lined up at the mess hall, metal trays in hand, expecting the watery soup and stale bread that had characterized their rations in North Africa. Instead, the American cooks loaded their trays with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee with sugar and cream. Giovanni stared at his tray in disbelief. This was more food than he had seen in a single meal since before the war. Around him, other Italians reacted with similar amazement, speaking in rapid dialects, unable to comprehend that their captors were feeding them this well. One prisoner, a Sicilian named Salvatore who had been half-starved in the desert, actually wept as he ate, overcome by the simple abundance of calories. Marco, eating steadily beside Giovanni, offered perspective. "They feed their own soldiers this way," he said. "We get the same rations they do. That's the law." But more than law, Marco suggested, it revealed something about American resources. A country that could feed its prisoners this well was a country with resources beyond imagination. Giovanni thought of his family in Naples, thought of the rationing they endured, the black markets, the constant hunger that had become normal in wartime Italy. Here, in a prison camp thousands of miles from home, he was eating better than he had in years. The work began that first morning. The Italian prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven to the cotton fields where the harvest was reaching its peak. The plantation owner, a man named Douglas Pritchard who had farmed this land for 30 years, needed every available hand to bring in the crop before weather could damage it. The labor shortage created by military mobilization had left him desperate for workers. The prisoner of war program offered a solution. The government would provide labor, the farmer would pay the government, and the prisoners would receive a small wage while being housed and fed at government expense. For Pritchard, it was the difference between a successful harvest and financial disaster. Giovanni had never picked cotton. In Italy, he had occasionally helped his uncle in the olive groves, but this was different. The cotton bolls had to be pulled carefully from the plants, avoiding the sharp bracts that could tear your hands, depositing the cotton into a long sack that dragged behind you as you moved down the rows. The work was backbreaking, repetitive, and exhausting in the Delta heat. But it was also strangely peaceful. There were no bombs, no bullets, no officers screaming orders while shells exploded around you. Just the sun, the fields, and the simple physical labor that had occupied farmers for centuries. What shocked Giovanni more than the work itself was how they were treated during it. American guards accompanied them to the fields, but the guards seemed more interested in preventing escape than in driving the prisoners to work harder. There was no brutality, no beatings, no screaming. When prisoners needed water, water was provided. When the midday heat became dangerous, they were given rest breaks in the shade. The plantation foreman, a lean man named Curtis who had managed these fields for 2 decades, treated them like any other workers rather than like enemies or slaves. He showed them efficient techniques for picking, offered advice on avoiding the worst of the heat, and at the end of each day counted their output with the same matter-of-fact professionalism he might have shown hired hands. The second shock came at the end of the first week when prisoners received their wages. 80 cents per day for 6 days of work meant $4.80, paid in camp script that looked like play money but could be exchanged for real goods at the camp canteen. Giovanni, who had not held any form of currency in months, stared at the bills in his hand with something approaching reverence. In wartime Italy, $4 would have been a significant sum. Here, it was pocket change, but it represented something profoundly important. It represented recognition that his labor had value, that even as a prisoner he possessed economic agency, that the Americans saw him as something more than just a captured enemy to be warehoused until the war ended. The canteen, when Giovanni first visited it, delivered the third shock. The small building at the center of camp stocked an array of goods that seemed impossible for a prison facility. There were cigarettes, several brands to choose from. There was candy, chocolate bars that Giovanni had not tasted since before the war. There were toiletries, writing paper, magazines, playing cards. There were even musical instruments available for rent. The prices were reasonable, calibrated so that a prisoner's weekly wage could purchase luxuries that made captivity more bearable. Giovanni bought chocolate, cigarettes, and writing paper. That evening, he sat on his bunk and composed a letter to his mother, the first communication he had been able to send home since his capture. The Red Cross would deliver it eventually, he was told, though it might take months to reach Naples through the disrupted European postal systems. The routine of camp life established itself quickly. Wake at 6, breakfast at 6:30, trucks to the fields by 7. Work until noon with a 15-minute break mid-morning. Lunch in the shade of the trucks, simple but substantial sandwiches and fruit and water. Work until 5 in the afternoon, another break at 3. Return to camp, dinner at 6, evening hours free until lights out at 10. The routine was monotonous but predictable, and after the chaos of combat and the uncertainty of capture, predictability felt like luxury. Giovanni fell into the rhythm, his body adapting to the physical labor, his mind adjusting to the strange reality of comfortable captivity. But it was the small things, the unexpected details of American life that prisoners encountered, that began to fundamentally alter Giovanni's understanding of the country holding him. The first Sunday at Camp Como, prisoners were informed they could attend religious services if they wished. A Catholic priest from Greenville, Father Thomas O'Brien, whose own grandparents had immigrated from Ireland, came to the camp to conduct Mass. Giovanni attended, as did most of the Italians, men who had grown up in a culture where Catholicism was woven into the fabric of daily life. Father O'Brien conducted the service in Latin, as was traditional, but he spoke to the prisoners afterward in English translated by one of the bilingual guards. The priest's message was simple. "You are far from home," he said. "You are prisoners, yes, but you are also children of God. While you are here, you will be treated with dignity. The church will help however it can. If you need anything, tell the chaplain." Giovanni was struck not just by the words but by the fact that they were spoken at all. In fascist Italy, the state and the church had reached an accommodation, but there had always been tension, always the sense that ideology and faith were in competition for loyalty. Here, the Americans seemed to see no contradiction between imprisoning enemy soldiers and ensuring their spiritual needs were met. The fourth shock, perhaps the most profound, came a few weeks into Giovanni's captivity when he witnessed how American soldiers interacted with each other. The guards at Camp Como rotated regularly, different units taking shifts of a few weeks before being replaced by others. Giovanni noticed that regardless of rank, regardless of whether they were officers or enlisted men, the Americans treated each other with a casual equality that would have been unthinkable in the Italian military. Officers and enlisted men shared jokes, discussed baseball scores, debated politics without apparent concern about hierarchy. There was respect for rank, certainly, but it was professional respect rather than the rigid class-based deference that had characterized the Italian army. Giovanni observed an incident one afternoon that crystallized this difference. A young private, probably not more than 19 years old, was on guard duty at the camp entrance. A captain arrived in a jeep, apparently having driven himself rather than being chauffeured as Italian officers of equivalent rank would have expected. The private saluted smartly, but when the captain asked him how his day was going, the private responded with easy familiarity, complaining about the heat and mentioning that he was looking forward to going home on leave next month. The captain laughed, commiserated about the heat, and told the private to hang in there. The entire exchange took perhaps 30 seconds, but it revealed a military culture fundamentally different from what Giovanni had known. These Americans, despite their ranks and roles, seemed to view each other as fundamentally equal citizens temporarily playing different parts in the same national endeavor. Marco, watching the same interaction, offered his interpretation. "They think differently about people," he said. "In Italy, in Germany, there are those who give orders and those who take them, and everyone knows their place from birth. Here, they seem to believe anyone can be anything." Giovanni wasn't sure he entirely agreed with this assessment. It seemed too simple, but he could not deny that something about American social structure differed fundamentally from European hierarchies he had always accepted as natural and inevitable. The autumn of 1943 brought changes to camp routine. The cotton harvest concluded in October, and prisoners were reassigned to different work details. Some went to work on infrastructure projects, building roads and bridges for the county government. Others were assigned to timber operations in the forests north of the Delta. Giovanni found himself part of a detail sent to work at a canning factory in Greenville, processing vegetables for military and civilian consumption. The work was indoor, temperature-controlled, and less physically demanding than field labor. It also brought him into closer contact with American civilians for the first time. The canning factory employed primarily women, as most able-bodied men were either in the military or working in industries deemed more essential to the war effort. These women, ranging from teenagers to grandmothers, worked alongside the Italian prisoners with a pragmatism that surprised Giovanni. There was no hostility, no fear, just the shared goal of getting the work done. The factory supervisor, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Dorothy Henderson who had managed the facility since her husband's death 5 years earlier, treated the prisoners exactly as she treated her civilian employees. She explained tasks clearly, corrected mistakes without anger, and maintained productivity expectations that were demanding but reasonable. Giovanni worked at a station beside an American woman named Ellen Crawford, a 26-year-old whose husband was serving with the Army somewhere in the Pacific. Ellen had a 7-year-old daughter and worked at the factory to supplement her military allotment, trying to save money for after the war. She was friendly in a reserved way, asking Giovanni simple questions about Italy, about his family, about what he had studied before the war. Her curiosity was genuine rather than hostile, as though she understood that the man working beside her was a person with a life and history rather than just an enemy soldier who happened to be captured. Through these daily interactions, Giovanni's English improved rapidly. He had studied some English in university, enough to read basic texts, but conversation had been beyond him. Now, immersed in English every day, he began to grasp not just vocabulary but idiom and usage. Ellen corrected his grammar with good humor, teaching him American slang that his textbooks had never covered. Other workers did the same, creating an informal language school within the factory routine. By Christmas 1943, Giovanni could hold basic conversations, understand most of what was said around him, and express his thoughts with increasing fluency if not perfect grammar. Christmas at Camp Como revealed another unexpected dimension of American captivity. The camp administration organized a Christmas celebration for the prisoners, complete with a special dinner that featured turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and pie. A small decorated tree stood in the mess hall, and prisoners who played instruments were encouraged to perform. The American guards joined the celebration, sitting at tables with prisoners, sharing food and conversation as though the war outside the fence had temporarily ceased to exist. Captain Morrison gave a short speech, translated by the camp interpreter, expressing hope that the next Christmas would find everyone home with their families, that the war would end and peace would allow men to return to normal life. Giovanni, sitting with Marco and a dozen other Italians from their barracks, felt profoundly disoriented by the whole experience. They were prisoners. These Americans were their captors. Yet the atmosphere felt less like imprisonment than like some strange form of hospitality. The cognitive dissonance was extreme. How could a nation at war, a nation that had sent hundreds of thousands of young men to fight and die against Axis forces, simultaneously treat captured enemies with such consideration? The only explanation Giovanni could formulate was that Americans somehow separated the war from the individuals fighting it, viewing soldiers as men doing jobs rather than as embodiments of enemy ideology. The winter months brought slower work rhythms and more time for reflection. Prisoners organized language classes, teaching each other English and helping those with less education improve their literacy. They formed musical groups, sports teams, discussion circles. The camp library, modest but growing, accumulated donated books in Italian and English. Giovanni discovered American authors he had never encountered, reading Steinbeck and Hemingway and trying to understand this country through its literature. He wrote long letters home, dozens of pages describing his experiences, though he knew the censors read everything and he needed to be careful about what he revealed. News from Italy grew increasingly dire throughout the winter. After Mussolini's fall in July 1943 and Italy's armistice with the Allies in September, the country had been thrown into chaos. German forces had occupied the north, the Allies controlled the south, and civil war raged between fascist loyalists and partisan resistance fighters. Giovanni's family was in Naples, which had been liberated by Allied forces in October 1943, but the city had suffered extensive damage during the German occupation. His letters home went unanswered for months, creating agonizing uncertainty about whether his mother and sisters had survived. The prisoners at Camp Como fell into roughly 3 categories based on their political orientations. There were committed fascists who remained loyal to Mussolini even in captivity, who viewed their imprisonment as temporary and expected eventual German victory. There were anti-fascists who had always opposed the regime and saw Italy's defeat as liberation from dictatorship. And there was the vast majority, men like Giovanni who had never been particularly political, who had served because they were conscripted, who just wanted the war to end so they could return to normal life. Tensions sometimes flared between these groups, particularly between fascists and anti-fascists, but camp authorities generally managed to prevent serious conflicts. In February 1944, prisoners at Camp Como were given an option that would prove enormously consequential. The U.S. government, working with the Italian government in exile that had sided with the Allies, created a new status called Italian service units. Italian prisoners who signed on would be redesignated as cooperators rather than prisoners of war. They would receive better pay, more privileges, and would be contributing directly to the Allied war effort. The trade-off was that they would be acknowledging Italy's switch from Axis to Allied power, something that required them to effectively repudiate their service under Mussolini. Giovanni spent a week wrestling with the decision. Signing on meant betraying his oath as an Italian soldier, even though that oath had been to a government that no longer existed in any meaningful form. It meant actively helping the American war effort, working not as coerced labor but as voluntary participants. But it also meant acknowledging reality. Italy had switched sides. The fascist dream had collapsed. Mussolini was now a puppet of the Germans in northern Italy, controlling nothing, commanding nothing, reduced to a figurehead. The Italy Giovanni wanted to return to was the Italy working with the Allies, not the rump fascist state in the north. He signed on. So did Marco. So did approximately 60% of the Italians at Camp Como. The fascist diehards refused, viewing the offer as betrayal. Some were transferred to different camps where non-cooperative prisoners were concentrated. The atmosphere at Como improved noticeably after the political tensions eased. The men who remained had made their choice. They were no longer fighting against America. They were working toward the day when they could return to an Italy at peace. The improvement in status brought tangible benefits. Wages increased to the standard rate for agricultural labor in the region, suddenly giving Italian service unit members purchasing power that felt almost absurd. Giovanni could buy not just necessities but luxuries. He purchased a used guitar from a guard who was upgrading to a better model. He bought American magazines and practiced reading English. He sent money home through the Red Cross, small amounts that he hoped would reach his family and help them survive the chaos engulfing Italy. Spring 1944 brought Giovanni back to the fields as planting season began. But now he was working not as a prisoner but as a paid agricultural worker who happened to be Italian and happened to be restricted to a specific location. The distinction felt meaningful even though daily routine changed little. The psychological shift from captivity to cooperation altered his relationship with his circumstances. He began to pay closer attention to American agricultural methods, noticing techniques that might be applicable in Italy. He asked questions of the farmers he worked with, learning about crop rotation, soil management, mechanized farming practices that were common in America but rare in southern Italy. Douglas Pritchard, the plantation owner, noticed Giovanni's interest and began explaining things in detail. Pritchard was a practical man who cared about results rather than ideology. He recognized that Giovanni possessed intelligence and education, that he was more than just manual labor. One afternoon, Pritchard invited Giovanni to his house, a large colonial-style structure overlooking the cotton fields, and showed him the accounting books for the plantation. He explained the economics of farming, the calculations of cost and yield, the constant battle against weather and pests and market fluctuations. Giovanni absorbed it all, seeing agriculture not just as labor but as business, as science, as a complex system that required management and planning. That evening, sitting on Pritchard's porch drinking sweet tea, Giovanni asked the question that had been building in his mind for months. "Why are you teaching me this?" he asked. "Why do you care if an Italian prisoner understands American farming?" Pritchard was quiet for a moment, looking out over his fields in the fading light. "Because this war will end eventually," he said. "When it does, Italy will need to rebuild. You'll need people who know how to do things efficiently, who understand modern methods. Maybe something you learn here will help when you go home. Plus," Pritchard added with a slight smile, "you're working my land. If you understand what you're doing and why it matters, you'll do it better." The logic was quintessentially American in a way Giovanni was beginning to recognize. Enlightened self-interest combined with a kind of optimistic pragmatism that assumed teaching and helping others ultimately benefited everyone. It stood in sharp contrast to the zero-sum thinking that had characterized fascist ideology, where one nation's gain necessarily meant another's loss, where helping outsiders was weakness rather than strength. Summer 1944 brought news of the D-Day invasion, of Allied armies landing in Normandy and beginning the liberation of Western Europe. The war was clearly turning, victory becoming visible on the horizon. For Giovanni and the other Italians at Camp Como, this meant both hope and uncertainty. Hope because the war's end would mean eventual return home. Uncertainty because what would they be returning to? Italy remained divided, fought over, destroyed. The Allied advance up the Italian peninsula was slow and costly, every mile bought with blood and sacrifice. Giovanni's hometown of Naples was free but damaged. His family, according to letters that finally began arriving regularly, had survived but were struggling with poverty and shortages that made even wartime rationing in America seem abundant by comparison. The contrast between American plenty and Italian deprivation became a constant theme in Giovanni's thoughts. Working in American fields, living in American camps, shopping in American canteens, he witnessed a level of material prosperity that seemed almost incomprehensible. America was fully mobilized for war, sending millions of men overseas, producing weapons and equipment on a scale that dwarfed anything Axis powers had achieved, yet civilian life continued with minimal disruption. Americans complained about rationing, but their rationing meant reduced consumption rather than genuine hardship. They complained about shortages, but their shortages meant inconvenience rather than starvation. The sheer scale of American resources, the productive capacity of American industry and agriculture, was a revelation that reframed everything Giovanni thought he knew about global power. One incident in August 1944 crystallized this understanding in a way that Giovanni would remember for the rest of his life. A group of Italian service unit members, including Giovanni, were working to repair a damaged bridge outside Greenville. American Army engineers supervised the project, teaching the Italians construction techniques while working alongside them. During a break, one of the engineers, a sergeant named Mike Patterson from Ohio, shared food from his lunchbox. The meal was simple: 2 thick sandwiches made with fresh bread, roast beef, cheese, lettuce, and tomato, plus an apple, a bag of potato chips, and a thermos of coffee. Patterson ate one sandwich and offered the other to Giovanni, mentioning casually that his wife always packed too much food. Giovanni accepted the sandwich and stood there for a moment just looking at it. This was a lunch, an ordinary midday meal that an ordinary American worker brought from home without thinking twice about it. It contained more protein than most Italians saw in a week. The bread was fresh and soft, made from white flour that was increasingly rare in wartime Europe. The vegetables were fresh and abundant. Patterson had offered it almost apologetically, as though the quantity of food were insufficient rather than embarrassingly generous. In that moment, holding that sandwich, Giovanni understood something fundamental about the war and why the Axis powers had been doomed from the beginning. They had gone to war against a country so wealthy that its ordinary workers ate like Italian feast days, a country whose productive capacity was so vast that feeding prisoners of war the same rations as their own soldiers was economically trivial. He said as much to Marco that evening, trying to articulate what the sandwich had revealed. Marco, who had been thinking along similar lines, agreed. "We never had a chance," he said. "Italy, Germany, Japan, we were fighting countries that could simply outproduce us. All the ideology, all the propaganda about superior will and racial destiny, none of it mattered because they could build more ships, more planes, more tanks, more everything. And they could do it while still feeding their people, still maintaining civilian life, still treating prisoners according to law. We were trying to conquer the world with countries that couldn't even feed their own populations adequately." The realization was simultaneously liberating and humiliating. Liberating because it meant that their defeat was not a moral failing but a mathematical inevitability. Humiliating because it meant that everything they had been told about fascist strength and Allied weakness had been lies, dangerous lies that had cost millions of lives. Giovanni thought about the young men he had known who had died in North Africa, who had believed they were fighting for Italian glory, for civilization, for a new Roman Empire. They had died for nothing, for fantasies, for the delusions of men who had sent armies to fight wars they could not possibly win. Autumn 1944 brought changes to Camp Como as the war situation evolved. More Italian prisoners arrived from Europe as Allied forces advanced. These new arrivals brought fresh stories of the fighting in Italy, of the destruction, of the partisan warfare tearing the country apart. They also brought a different perspective, having been captured more recently. Many viewed the Italian service unit members with suspicion, seeing them as traitors who had abandoned their comrades and their oaths. Giovanni found himself defending his decision repeatedly, arguing that the oath had been to Italy not to fascism, that choosing to cooperate with the Allies meant choosing to help rebuild Italy rather than prolong a war that was already lost. The tensions within the Italian prisoner population reflected broader tensions within Italy itself. The country was splitting into those who supported the co-belligerent government working with the Allies and those who remained loyal to Mussolini's Northern Republic. Brothers fought on opposite sides. Old friendships shattered. The Civil War dimension of Italy's experience, often overshadowed by the larger Allied Axis conflict, created divisions that would last for generations. Giovanni, writing to his mother, urged his younger brother not to join the partisans, not to throw his life away in fighting that had already been decided. He did not know if his letters reached home, if his advice was heeded, or if his brother even survived. Christmas 1944 was subdued compared to the previous year. The war continued with no end clearly in sight despite Allied successes. American casualties mounted as fighting in France and Germany intensified. The cost of victory was becoming clear, the realization that even winning would mean hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded. Giovanni attended midnight mass on Christmas Eve in the camp chapel, a simple wooden structure built by prisoners earlier that year. Father O'Brien conducted the service, and in his homily he spoke about the meaning of peace, about the hope that next Christmas would find the world at rest, about the duty to build something better after the guns finally fell silent. Giovanni prayed that night, prayed for his family, for his brother, for Marco and the other men at Camp Como, for the countless millions caught up in a war none of them had wanted. He prayed for understanding, for wisdom to make sense of what he had experienced and what it meant for his future. He was 25 years old, educated, intelligent, a man who should have been building a career and starting a family. Instead he was a prisoner of war thousands of miles from home, waiting for a future that remained uncertain in almost every detail. The winter of 1945 brought the beginning of the end. News arrived of Soviet advances into Germany from the east, of American and British advances from the west, of the Third Reich collapsing under unstoppable pressure. In Italy, partisan forces grew stronger as German control weakened. The Allies pushed northward, slowly but inexorably, liberating city after city. By April 1945, it was clear that the war in Europe would end within weeks. Mussolini was captured and executed by partisans on April 28, Hitler committed suicide in Berlin on April 30, Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7 and 8, 1945. The war was over. Giovanni stood in the Camp Como courtyard on the morning of May 8, listening to Captain Morrison read the announcement of German surrender, and felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, grief, and uncertainty. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for all that had been lost, for the years stolen, for the millions dead, for the Italy he had known that no longer existed. Victory in Europe did not mean immediate freedom. Giovanni and thousands of Italian prisoners remained in American camps awaiting transportation home. Ships were scarce, priorities elsewhere. Captain Morrison explained repatriation would take months, perhaps over a year. They would continue working, being housed and fed, until circumstances permitted return. The psychological shift was profound. They were no longer combatants but displaced persons waiting to go home. Guards relaxed vigilance. Restrictions eased. Giovanni's first trip to Greenville as a visitor came in June. 20 Italians spent Saturday afternoon in town. They walked Main Street, marveled at abundance despite rationing. An elderly woman pressed a dollar bill into Giovanni's hand, saying her son had been stationed in Italy and locals there had been kind. The gesture moved him profoundly. That summer Giovanni worked on Tom Richardson's farm outside Greenville. Richardson treated him as an employee rather than prisoner, paying standard wages, inviting him to eat lunch with the family. One evening Tom suggested Giovanni might consider staying in America. The suggestion was tempting. America offered stability, prosperity, opportunity. But Giovanni knew he could not stay. His family was in Naples. His country needed people willing to rebuild it. Giovanni received his repatriation orders in September. He would leave Camp Como on September 24, travel to New York, board a ship for Naples. The final weeks were filled with farewells. Tom Richardson brought food for Giovanni's journey. Margaret included a package for Giovanni's mother with soap, coffee, chocolate, things common in America but precious in Europe. As the ship approached Naples on October 9, what Giovanni saw shocked him. The waterfront was devastated. Buildings reduced to shells. Port facilities heavily damaged. He carried his duffel bag through damaged streets toward his family's neighborhood. His mother's house was still standing, damaged but intact. When the door opened, his mother pulled him into an embrace that communicated everything words could not. That first evening, Giovanni tried to describe his experience in America. His family listened with disbelief. They could not comprehend a prison camp where prisoners were well fed, well treated, paid for their labor. His mother held the handkerchief he had bought in Greenville and cried. Naples was struggling desperately. Food was scarce. Infrastructure destroyed. Giovanni's education in architecture proved valuable. He worked as a draftsman assisting architects in assessing damage and planning repairs. During this period he began writing down his experiences in America, observations about American agriculture, industry, social organization, Treatment of prisoners. The Marshall Plan brought American aid to Italy in 1947. Giovanni watched with vindication as Americans extended to entire nations the same practical generosity they had shown individual prisoners. By 1948 he had completed his architecture degree. In 1949 he married Sophia, a teacher. Their son Luca was born in 1951. Throughout the 1950s, as Italy experienced its economic miracle, Giovanni maintained correspondence with Tom Richardson. In 1973 Giovanni returned to America, attending an architecture conference in New York, then visiting Mississippi. He and Tom spent an afternoon on the porch talking about how the world had changed. In the late 70s Giovanni wrote a memoir about his experience. Published in 1981, it received modest attention but found an audience among those interested in personal narratives of war and Reconstruction. Giovanni continued his architectural practice into the 80s, mentoring young architects, speaking at schools about the war's lessons. Giovanni Russo passed away in 1998 at 78. He died peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren. His funeral was well attended because he had built a good life, contributed meaningfully to his community. The full significance of Giovanni's experience lies in accumulated daily interactions that revealed fundamental truths about different approaches to warfare and human dignity. Of approximately 50,000 Italian prisoners held in the United States during World War II, fewer than 200 died in custody, a death rate below 1%. The prisoners were fed adequately, housed according to Geneva Convention standards, provided with medical care, and paid for their labor. For Giovanni Russo and thousands like him, American captivity represented exposure to alternative social and political systems that fundamentally challenged everything fascist ideology had taught them. They discovered that a democratic society could be both powerful and humane, that treating even enemies with dignity did not represent weakness but strength, that prosperity could be built through productive efficiency rather than military conquest. The choice to treat prisoners humanely was not purely altruistic. It served practical purposes. Well-treated prisoners provided useful labor without requiring brutal coercion. They became positive influences on post-war societies rather than sources of instability and resentment. Enlightened self-interest aligned with moral principle to produce policies that benefited everyone involved. Giovanni Russo lived to see the world transformed by these lessons. The Italy he returned to in 1945 was shattered and impoverished. The Italy of the 1990s where he spent his final years was prosperous and democratic, integrated into European and Atlantic institutions, at peace with its neighbors. That transformation required millions of individual choices and vast institutional changes. But it rested partly on foundations laid when defeated soldiers were treated with unexpected decency by the nation that had defeated them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.